The shell exploded before it should have, not on impact, not after a timer ran out, but in midair precisely where the enemy aircraft had been a heartbeat before. The pilot never saw it coming. One moment he was diving toward the American fleet, the next he was engulfed in a sphere of shrapnel that ripped his plane apart like paper. No warning, no escape, just sudden impossible death from invisible technology that rewrote the mathematics of survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The admirals called it VT, short for variable time, but that name was a lie designed to hide the truth. The fuse had nothing to do with time, it was a radio proximity detonator, a miniature miracle of physics and engineering packed into an artillery shell. It could sense when an aircraft was near, could calculate the perfect moment to detonate, could turn every anti-aircraft gun into a weapon of terrifying precision, and in the summer of 1944, Japanese naval aviators had no idea it existed. Lieutenant Kenneth Morrison stood on the deck of the USS Alabama on the morning of June 20th, watching the horizon turn from black to gray. The battleship rocked gently beneath his boots, its massive 16-inch guns silent for now but ready. Morrison was a fire control officer, a man who lived in the space between mathematics and violence. He calculated trajectories, adjusted for wind and ship movement, translated chaos into numbers that gunners could use. For 2 years he had done this work with conventional shells, watching them explode too late or too early, watching Japanese planes slip through the curtain of fire like ghosts. But today was different. Today the Alabama carried a secret in its magazines, thousands of shells fitted with fuses that would change everything. Morrison had been briefed 3 days earlier in a windowless room below decks. The officer who explained the technology spoke in hushed tones as if the walls themselves might be listening. The VT fuse was classified at the highest level. If the Japanese captured even one unexploded shell, if they reverse-engineered the technology, the advantage would vanish. So the orders were clear: use them only over water where duds would sink, never over land where the enemy might recover them, and tell no one outside the fleet. Morrison had studied the technical specifications until his eyes burned. Inside each shell, smaller than a coffee can, engineers had packed a radio transmitter, a receiver, amplifier tubes, batteries, and an electric detonator. When the shell was fired, the tremendous acceleration activated the fuse. As the shell flew toward its target, the transmitter broadcast radio waves. When those waves bounced off a nearby aircraft and returned to the receiver, the signal strength would spike. At exactly the right moment, when the mathematics of reflection indicated the target was within lethal radius, the fuse would trigger the explosive. All of this happened in milliseconds, faster than any human could react. The genius was in the details. The tubes had to withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity during firing. The circuits had to work after being spun at hundreds of revolutions per second. The batteries had to function in temperatures that ranged from Arctic cold to tropical heat. Dozens of companies had contributed components, each building one piece of a puzzle they were never allowed to see complete. The final assembly happened in secure facilities where workers were searched before leaving, where scrap was accounted for down to the gram. Morrison remembered the first time he held one of the shells. It looked ordinary, just another 5-inch round with a slightly different nose cone. But knowing what was inside changed everything. This was not just ammunition. This was the product of thousands of engineers, millions of dollars, years of testing compressed into a device that would exist for perhaps 30 seconds before destroying itself and its target. The weight of that knowledge settled on Morrison like a physical thing. Around him the deck crews moved with practiced efficiency. Men in sweat-stained shirts hauled shells from the magazines, stacking them in ready racks beside each gun mount. The 5-inch guns, dual-purpose weapons that could engage both surface targets and aircraft, bristled along the Alabama's superstructure. 12 of them, each capable of firing 15 rounds per minute. With VT fuses, Morrison calculated, they could create a killing zone unlike anything the enemy had encountered. The task force had been at sea for 6 days, pushing west across the Pacific toward the Mariana Islands. The mission was simple in concept, brutal in execution: destroy Japanese air power, secure the islands, move the war closer to Tokyo. Intelligence reported heavy enemy air strength in the region, perhaps 500 aircraft spread across multiple airfields. The Japanese would defend desperately. They had to. Lose the Marianas and American B-29 bombers would be able to reach the Japanese home islands. Morrison's station was in the starboard fire control director, a cramped space filled with optical instruments and communication equipment. His crew consisted of 6 men, a director-trainer who kept the sights on target, a pointer who managed elevation, a rangefinder operator, 2 radar technicians, and Morrison himself coordinating everything. They had drilled together for months, learning to work as a single organism, translating the chaos of aerial combat into the precise language of gunnery solutions. The previous evening, the gunnery officer had gathered all fire control teams for a final briefing. Commander Richard Ashford was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the calculating gaze of someone who saw the world as a series of problems to be solved. He had been skeptical of the VT fuse at first, Morrison knew. Ashford trusted mathematics he could verify, and the classified nature of the technology meant he could not examine the calculations himself, but test results had convinced him. In trials, Vermont fused shells had achieved hit rates 5 times higher than conventional anti-aircraft fire. Ashford stood before a blackboard covered in diagrams, his voice crisp and unemotional. The enemy would come in waves, he explained. Dive bombers attacking from high altitude, torpedo planes skimming the water, fighters trying to strafe the decks. Traditional doctrine called for a barrage pattern, filling sections of sky with explosions and hoping enemy aircraft flew into them. With VT fuses, the approach changed. They could fire at individual targets, could track specific aircraft and detonate shells at the optimal moment. The psychological impact alone would be devastating. Imagine being a pilot, he said, watching shells explode around you with impossible accuracy, unable to evade because the weapon anticipated your movements. Morrison had listened, making notes, running scenarios in his head. The mathematics were elegant. A conventional shell had to pass within a few feet of an aircraft to be effective. The blast radius was small, the timing had to be perfect. Miss by a second, and the shell exploded harmlessly in empty sky. But a VT shell could detonate anywhere within 70 feet of a target. The lethal radius expanded by orders of magnitude. It was the difference between throwing a rock and detonating a bomb. Sleep had been difficult that night. Morrison lay in his bunk listening to the thrum of the ship's engines, thinking about the men in those Japanese aircraft. They were the enemy, yes, but they were also pilots doing their duty, following orders, believing in their cause. The VT fuse would kill them before they understood what was happening. There would be no learning curve, no adaptation. The first time they encountered the technology would likely be the last thing they ever encountered. Dawn brought a strange clarity. Morrison climbed to his station as the sky shifted from black to deep blue to pale gold. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, empty and peaceful. Other ships of the task force were visible as dark shapes on the horizon, carriers with aircraft crowding their decks, cruisers cutting white wakes through the water, destroyers racing back and forth like nervous dogs. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese scout planes were searching for this fleet. When they found it, the attack would come. The waiting was the hardest part. Morrison checked and rechecked his equipment. The optical rangefinder was calibrated. The radar set hummed with electronic life. The communication lines to the gun mounts were clear. His crew sat at their stations, silent, each man alone with his thoughts. Morrison knew what they were thinking because he was thinking it too. Today they would discover if the secret weapon lived up to its promise. Today they would learn if American engineering could overcome Japanese determination. At 0730 hours, the radar operator's voice cut through the silence. Contact bearing 270, range 80 miles, multiple targets. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. He keyed the intercom to the bridge. Fire control reports radar contact, estimated 40-plus aircraft inbound. The response came immediately. All stations condition 1, man all guns. Prepare for air action. The deck erupted into controlled chaos. Men sprinted to their positions. Gun crews loaded shells, the first rounds carrying the precious VT fuses. Damage control teams stood ready with hoses and repair equipment. Below decks, the magazines opened, ready to feed the hungry guns. Morrison watched through his optics as the carriers turned into the wind, launching their own fighters to intercept the incoming raid. Corsairs and Hellcats roared off the flight decks, climbing toward the threat, but some would get through. They always did. And when they came within range of the Alabama's guns, Morrison and his crew would be ready with a weapon the enemy could not anticipate, could not counter, could not survive. He pressed his eye to the rangefinder, adjusting the focus, waiting for the first glimpse of enemy aircraft. The voice of Commander Ashford crackled over the circuit. All fire control stations, weapons free. Engage all hostile VT fuses authorized. Morrison took a breath, steadied himself, and replied, "Fire control acknowledges." Standing by, in the distance the first black specks appeared against the morning sky. They grew larger, resolving into the distinctive shapes of Japanese aircraft. Dive bombers with their fixed landing gear, torpedo planes flying low over the water, fighters weaving above them. They came on in formation, precise and determined, heading straight for the heart. Morrison's hand moved to the fire content, kill goal solution, calculating range, bearing, altitude. The mathematics flowed through him like music. He was ready, the guns were ready, the VT fuses were ready, and the enemy had no idea what was about to happen. The battle for the Marianas was about to become a demonstration of how technology could transform war from an art into a science, and how men who mastered that science could achieve what had seemed impossible. For Morrison, for his crew, for every man in the task force, this was the moment when theory became reality, when classified briefings became fire and death, when the future arrived with the shriek of incoming aircraft, and the thunder of guns about to rewrite the rules of naval combat. The Japanese formation split as it approached, a tactical decision born from hard experience. Dive bombers climbed for altitude, while torpedo planes dropped to wave-top level.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Fighters accelerated ahead, trying to suppress the anti-aircraft fire before the bombers committed to their runs. It was a coordinated attack, the kind of operation that had devastated American forces at Pearl Harbor, that had sunk British capital ships in the Indian Ocean, that had carried Japanese power across half the Pacific. But that was 3 years ago. The Navy they faced now was different, hardened by loss, equipped with weapons that existed only in theory when the war began. Morrison tracked the lead formation through his optics, his mind automatically calculating intercept angles. The dive bombers were at 12,000 feet and climbing, seeking the altitude that would give them speed and accuracy when they rolled into their attack dives. Conventional doctrine would wait until they committed, would try to catch them in the vulnerable moment when they were diving toward their targets and could not maneuver. Morrison had different orders. Engage at maximum effective range, do not let them establish their attack runs. The VT fuse meant he could fire while the enemy was still maneuvering, could engage them miles from the fleet, could create a barrier of explosions that would shatter formations before they became dangerous. He called the solution to the gun mounts. Target bearing 285, elevation 45 degrees, range 18,000 yards. Load VT, commence firing on my mark. The response came back instantly. Mount 5-1 ready. Mount 5-2 ready. Morrison counted heartbeats, watching the targets crawl across his field of view. The timing had to be precise. Fire too early and the shells would detonate before the aircraft arrived. Fire too late, and the enemy would be too close, too spread out to engage effectively. He let the mathematics guide him, trusting the calculations that filled his head. "Mark," he said quietly. The 5-inch gun spoke with a sound like the end of the world. The Alabama shuddered as dozens of shells launched simultaneously, arcing upward into the morning sky. Morrison watched their vapor trails climb toward the enemy formation. Seconds passed. The Japanese aircraft flew on, unaware. Then the sky above them transformed into a garden of fire. The shells detonated in perfect sequence, each explosion creating a sphere of shrapnel 70 feet across. The first bomber flew directly into one burst and disintegrated, its wings separating from the fuselage as if cut by invisible scissors. The second tried to turn away and flew into another explosion. The third managed to release its bomb early, a wasted weapon that fell harmlessly into the ocean, before the aircraft itself was shredded by fragments moving faster than sound. Morrison's crew worked with mechanical precision. The director-trainer kept the optics locked on the target area. The pointer adjusted elevation as the enemy formation scattered. The rangefinder operator called out distances while the radar technicians fed continuous updates on target positions. Morrison processed it all, translating movement into numbers, numbers into fire and solutions, solutions into death delivered at 20,000 yards. The Japanese pilots must have thought they were flying into a wall of solid explosions. No matter which way they turned, shells burst around them with uncanny accuracy. Some tried to climb above the barrage, only to find that the explosions climbed with them. Others dove toward the water, but the VT shells followed, detonating at precisely calculated altitudes. The mathematics were merciless. Through his optics, Morrison watched a Val dive bomber attempt a splits maneuver, rolling inverted and pulling down in a desperate attempt to escape. A 5-inch shell tracked the movement, its proximity fuse calculating the intercept point, detonating 10 feet above the cockpit. The bomber's canopy shattered. The aircraft tumbled out of control, streaming smoke, falling toward the ocean like a broken toy. The intercom crackled with reports from other fire control stations. Mount 3-1 reports 3 kills. Mount 4-2 reports ammunition running low, requesting resupply. Morrison acknowledged each transmission while maintaining his own firing solution. The enemy formation was breaking apart, individual aircraft scattering in all directions as pilots realized their coordinated attack had become a slaughter. But the torpedo planes were still coming. They skimmed across the wave tops at 200 feet, flying so low the radar could barely track them. This was the classic approach, using the ocean itself as cover, betting that anti-aircraft guns could not depress low enough to engage them effectively. It had worked at Pearl Harbor. It had worked at Midway. The Japanese pilots had practiced this attack profile for years, had perfected the art of low-altitude navigation, had learned to judge distances by eye when instruments were useless. Morrison shifted his attention to the new threat. Tracking low-altitude targets was harder. The radar returned contaminated by reflections from the ocean surface. But the VT fuse did not care about radar clutter. It sensed the aircraft directly, distinguished metal from water, calculated proximity with electronic precision. He called the new solution to the gun mounts. Target bearing 300, elevation -2 degrees. Range 12,000 yards. All mounts engaged torpedo planes. Fire. The guns pivoted downward, their barrels pointed at the horizon. When they fired, the shells skipped across the top of their ballistic arcs and descended toward the water. Morrison had calculated the trajectories to detonate the shells at exactly 200 feet altitude, creating a curtain of fire just above the waves. The torpedo planes flew directly into it. The lead aircraft simply vanished, consumed by an explosion that left nothing but falling debris. The second managed to release its torpedo before disintegrating, but the weapon ran wild, its gyroscope damaged by the shockwave, spiraling uselessly away from the fleet. The third aircraft tried to turn parallel to the American line, presenting its smallest profile, but another shell detonated alongside it. Shrapnel punctured the fuel tanks. Fire bloomed along the fuselage. The aircraft cartwheeled into the ocean, creating a brief fountain of spray before sinking. Morrison allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The VT fuse was performing beyond even the optimistic estimates from testing. Every shell was finding its target. Every detonation optimally placed. The hit rate was not 5 times better than conventional fire. It was 10 times, 20 times better. The Japanese were flying into certain death, and they had no counter, no defense, no hope. Commander Ashford's voice came over the command circuit. All stations, enemy fighters inbound. Brace for strafing runs. Morrison looked up from his optics and saw them coming. 0 fighters, a dozen at least, diving from altitude with their machine guns already firing. Tracers laced through the air, stitching patterns of light against the sky. This was personal combat, the kind of close-range engagement where the enemy pilot could see the faces of the men he was trying to kill. But the VT shells did not care about personal combat. They exploded with the same mathematical precision, whether the target was 10 miles away or 10 seconds from impact. Morrison designated targets by priority, calling out bearing and range even as bullets whined past the final control director. Mount 5-1, fighter at 295, 3,000 yards. Mount 5-2, fighter at 310, 2,500 yards. Engage, engage, engage. The guns swiveled and fired almost faster than Morrison could follow. The air filled with the thunder of detonations, the shriek of shell fragments, the scream of aircraft engines pushed beyond their limits. A Zero pulled up from its strafing run and flew directly into a cluster of airbursts. The fighter came apart in sections, nose, wings, tail, each piece tumbling separately into the sea. Another tried to escape by climbing vertically, trading speed for altitude, but a shell detonated 50 feet above it. The Zero shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine, then fell back into a terminal dive. The mathematics were beautiful in their brutality. Every variable was accounted for: wind speed, ship motion, target velocity, shell ballistics, all processed through Morrison's mind and translated into commands his crew executed without hesitation. They were no longer individuals, they were a weapons system, human and machine integrated into something greater than either alone. Minutes passed like hours. Morrison's world narrowed to the view through his optics, the stream of calculations, the steady rhythm of commands and acknowledgments. The pile of spent shell casings around the gun mounts grew larger. The smell of cordite hung thick in the air. Men's ears rang from the constant percussion, but they did not stop, did not slow, did not give the enemy even a moment to regroup. The Japanese attack finally broke. The surviving aircraft, perhaps a quarter of the original force, turned away from the fleet and fled west. Some were trailing smoke, others wobbled in flight, barely controllable. They had been mauled, shattered by a weapon they did not understand and could not fight. Morrison watched them go, his hand still on the fire control solution, ready to engage if they turned back. They did not turn back. The sky cleared, the guns fell silent. The sudden absence of noise was almost painful. Morrison's ears still rang, his hands trembled slightly from adrenaline. Around him, his crew sagged in their stations, exhausted by the intensity of the engagement. The radar operator reported the tactical situation, all hostile contacts departing. No further threats detected. Morrison keyed the intercom to the bridge. Fire control reports engagement complete. Enemy formation destroyed. Request permission to stand down from general quarters. The response came from Commander Ashford himself, and Morrison could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Well done, fire control. Maintain condition 1 for another hour, then stand down. Excellent shooting. Below on the deck, damage control teams were already assessing the results of the Japanese strafing runs. A few bullet holes in the superstructure, some minor fires quickly extinguished, one sailor wounded by a ricocheting fragment. Compared to what might have been, it was nothing. Without the VT fuses, the enemy attack would have been far more dangerous. Bombs would have fallen, torpedoes would have run, men would have died. Morrison pulled back from his optics and looked at his crew. They were young men, most of them, barely out of their teens. The director trainer was from Iowa, had worked on his family's farm before the war. The pointer had been a college student studying mathematics. The rangefinder operator had sold insurance in Philadelphia. The radar technicians were both former radio enthusiasts who had built crystal sets as children, ordinary men transformed by war into something extraordinary. They had just killed dozens of enemy pilots. The mathematics told Morrison exactly how many, at least 40 aircraft destroyed, possibly more. Each one had carried a crew, men with families and histories and futures that now would never happen. Morrison felt the weight of that knowledge but did not let it paralyze him. This was war. The enemy would have killed him and his shipmates without hesitation. The VT fuse simply ensured that they died first, died before they could deliver their weapons, died without understanding what had killed them. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the task force continued west, the battle receding into the past with every mile. Morrison knew this was only the beginning. The Japanese would attack again, would throw more aircraft at the fleet, would test the American defenses with everything they had. And every time they came, the VT fuses would be waiting, invisible guardians that turned the sky itself into a killing ground. He thought about the engineers who had built this weapon, the scientists who had solved seemingly impossible problems, the factory workers who had assembled millions of components with microscopic precision. None of them would ever know the specific results of their labor, would never see the enemy aircraft falling from the sky, would never hear the grateful voices of the men whose lives the technology saved. But their work mattered. In the most literal sense, it was the difference between life and death. Morrison finally allowed himself to relax slightly, though his mind continued processing the engagement, analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. The VT fuse had exceeded all expectations, but there were still limitations. The shells were expensive, far more costly than conventional ammunition. The electronics could fail, though the reliability in this engagement had been perfect. And most importantly, the technology had to remain secret. If the Japanese captured even one unexploded shell and reverse-engineered the fuse, the advantage would vanish. That was why the orders were absolute: use VT shells only over water, where duds would sink into the depths, never fire them over land where the enemy might recover them. The security protocols were elaborate. Shells were counted before and after each engagement. Unexploded ordnance was tracked. If a VT shell failed to detonate over water, procedures existed for immediate recovery or destruction. The technology represented more than just tactical advantage. It was a symbol of American industrial might, of a nation that could not only design revolutionary weapons, but mass-produce them in quantities that overwhelmed the enemy. The Japanese built excellent aircraft, trained skilled pilots, fought with courage and determination, but they could not match the sheer scale of American production. For every aircraft they manufactured, American factories produced 5. For every pilot they trained, American flight schools graduated 10. The VT fuse was the ultimate expression of this industrial superiority. It was not a weapon that required exceptional skill to use. Any competent fire control team could employ it effectively. It did not rely on individual heroics or superior training. It worked through mathematics and engineering, through the application of scientific principles that were indifferent to courage or determination. It was war as system, war as process, war as the inevitable victory of greater resources applied with technical precision. The second wave arrived 3 hours later, larger than the first. Morrison's crew had rotated briefly for food and water, but returned to their stations with the same grim determination. The radar showed 70 contacts this time, approaching from multiple vectors. The Japanese had learned nothing from the morning's disaster, or perhaps they simply had no choice but to continue throwing aircraft into the meat grinder. This formation flew higher, trying to stay above the killing zone that had destroyed their comrades. Morrison adjusted his calculations accordingly. The beauty of the VT fuse was its adaptability. High altitude or low, fast or slow, the proximity detonation worked equally well. He called new solutions to the gun mounts, tracking clusters of enemy bombers as they assembled for their attack runs. The guns opened fire at maximum range, shells climbing into the thin air where the enemy thought they would be safe. The first explosions caught the Japanese completely off guard. Bombers at 15,000 feet disintegrated just as thoroughly as those at 5,000. A Kate torpedo bomber, its crew believing altitude was safety, flew into a burst that severed its tail section. The aircraft tumbled end over end, falling like a broken kite. Morrison worked methodically, prioritizing targets by threat level. Dive bombers got first attention, then torpedo planes, then fighters. His crew responded with machine efficiency, the entire system operating at peak performance. Shell after shell launched upward, each one carrying its invisible electronic brain, each one detonating at exactly the calculated moment. The Japanese pilots tried everything. Some attempted evasive maneuvers, jinking and weaving through the sky. The VT shells simply adjusted, exploding wherever the aircraft went. Others tried to overwhelm the defenses with numbers, clustering together in tight formations. Morrison smiled grimly and fired into the center of the groups, letting the overlapping blast patterns destroy multiple targets simultaneously. A Judy dive bomber managed to survive long enough to release its payload. Morrison tracked the falling bomb through his optics, calculating its trajectory instantly. It would miss, falling 200 yards short of the Alabama. The bomber tried to pull up and escape, but another ET shell was already tracking it. The explosion caught the aircraft in its climb, shredding control surfaces. The bomber rolled inverted and plunged into the ocean. By early afternoon, the ocean around Task Force 58 was littered with debris. Oil slicks marked where aircraft had fallen. Life rafts floated among the wreckage, though precious few Japanese pilots had managed to bail out before their aircraft disintegrated. The American Combat Air Patrol circled overhead, but they had little work to do. The VT fuses were doing most of the killing before enemy aircraft even reached visual range of the fleet. The third attack came at dusk, a desperate final attempt. Only 30 aircraft this time, all that remained of the massive force that had begun the day. They came in low as the sun set, trying to use the failing light as cover. Morrison's radar operators tracked them effortlessly, technology overcoming the ancient advantage of darkness. The guns fired into the twilight, creating brief flowers of flame against the darkening sky. The last Japanese aircraft fell just as night claimed the Pacific. Morrison watched it spiral downward, trailing fire, until it vanished into the black water. Then silence. The battle was over. The enemy had nothing left to throw at them. In one day, Japanese naval aviation in the Marianas had been effectively destroyed, not degraded, not weakened, destroyed. Commander Ashford summoned Morrison to the bridge after the action. The commander's face showed exhaustion, but also something like wonder. "I counted the reports," Ashford said quietly. "Your station alone accounted for 63 confirmed kills." 63, in a single day. Morrison nodded, unable to find words adequate to the magnitude of what had happened. The VT fuse casualty reports came in throughout the evening. Across the entire task force, over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed. American losses, 18 fighters, 2 dive bombers, no ship sunk. The mathematics were staggering, a kill ratio of nearly 17-1. It was not a battle, it was an execution. Morrison stood on deck that night, watching stars emerge in the tropical sky. Somewhere to the west, Japanese commanders were receiving reports that must have seemed impossible. How could so many aircraft simply vanish? How could American anti-aircraft fire suddenly become so devastatingly accurate? They would search for answers and find none. The VT fuse remained classified, its existence denied, its capabilities unacknowledged. The technology would continue killing Japanese pilots for the rest of the war. At Leyte Gulf, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, wherever enemy aircraft appeared, Vermont shells would be waiting. The Japanese would never develop an effective counter. How could they counter something they did not understand, could not capture, could not study? Morrison thought about the men in those aircraft, young pilots who had died without knowing what killed them. They had flown with courage, had pressed their attacks despite impossible odds, had died believing in their mission. The VT fuse had given them no chance. It had been mathematics against flesh, engineering against determination, and mathematics had won absolutely. The war would continue for another year, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. American technology, American production, American innovation had created weapons the enemy could not match. The VT fuse was just one example, perhaps the most dramatic, but it represented a larger truth. This was industrial war, and the nation with greater industry would prevail. In the years after the war, the VT fuse would be recognized as one of the most significant weapons developments of the conflict. Military historians would call it a revolution in air defense. Scientists would study its design as a masterpiece of miniaturization and rugged engineering. But for Morrison and the thousands of men who had used it in combat, it would always be something simpler. It was the weapon that kept them alive. It was the invisible shield that turned certain death into survival. It was proof that human ingenuity, given enough time and resources, could solve even the hardest problems. Morrison never forgot June 20th, 1944, never forgot the sight of enemy aircraft falling from the sky like rain, never forgot the knowledge that inside each shell was a small miracle of science, working exactly as designed, killing precisely and efficiently. War was brutal, but the VT fuse had made it calculable. That was the true revolution, not just winning, but winning with mathematical certainty. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.